Hi, and welcome to Rapid Fire Wednesday, Q&A for corporate immigration professionals. I'm Kimberley Best Robidoux, a partner in our San Diego office. And I'm joined, as always, by Miki Matrician, who's co-managing partner in the Boston office. How are you today, Miki?
Hi, Kim. Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. We're trying to slog through the recent events. With part of that, for today's installment of Rapid Fire Wednesday, we're going to discuss preparing for international travel of foreign national employees, especially in light of the recent presidential election. But also, this time of year is always around holiday travel, travel for weddings, and then just getting out of the United States to go home and see family members towards the end of the year and for the New Year celebrations. And then continuing on into January, February for Chinese New Year as well. So it gets really busy for us at WR Immigration with our wonderful corporate clients who are asking about travel for their foreign national employees, and then with the employees who are traveling as well, is just trying to make sure that they have all their ducks in a row. So Mickey, I really can't believe that we're only, a couple weeks away from Thanksgiving. The holidays are coming up really, really fast. With that, we all travel for the most part. There's a lot of people who travel, even if it might be 5 miles down the street, but there's a lot of domestic travel and international travel. As we think about that, what are some of the concerns that your corporate clients and foreign national employees have, especially this year, but in general about international travel?
Yeah, definitely. Time seems to be kind of on warp speed right now. And yeah, it's that time of year. As you said, we have lots of questions from clients about international travel and going back to their home countries for holidays and family events. So, I guess the thing is that it's really easy to leave the US, but it's coming back that can be problematic if the foreign national hasn't planned appropriately, right, with the right documents and being prepared if there's an interview. So, partner with my clients to plan for the return. And what that means is that for non US citizens and permanent residents, each individual really needs to make sure that they have the right set of documents to present at the consulate and at CBP at the port of entry in order to be admitted into the US.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, it's super easy to leave. I mean, especially here at the southern border, people can just drive right into Tijuana and they don't even realize it, except for the big warning signs. But if you're distracted, you might just continue on down. So yes, it's very easy to leave, but not so easy to get back in. So with that, we're going to get a little bit in the nitty gritty here. What do you typically talk with your clients about and recommend in terms of what documentation and processes, specifically documentation, that they'll need in order to return to the US following the international travel?
Yeah. So, typically every individual needs a passport that's valid for at least 6 months from the date they return to the US. So that's at a minimum, right? And then in addition, for people on temporary work visas, they need to have a valid visa stamp in their passport in order to seek entry into the US. And then there are exceptions to this rule that we'll talk about in a bit. So, with my global mobility professionals, we are always reminding their employees to make sure they have a valid visa stamp and the passport. If they don't, then it's important to plan the weeks and sometimes months in advance to submit a non immigrant visa application to the US consulate abroad in order to apply for a new visa stamp to get that prior to returning to the US. And then each US consular post is different with their processing times. And in some cases, the procedures might vary. So it's really important for my clients to plan in advance and we partner with them. And then, as part of the documentation package, if there is a visa application that's at play, then getting an employment verification letter is usually required by the consular post when processing the visa application.
Yeah. So, Mickey, questions that, I typically receive from clients are: do all foreign nationals need to have an interview with the consular post when they're applying for their visa stamp? As well as typically, how long does it take to get the passport back with a new visa stamp so that I can get back to the US? So, what do you see with respect to these questions?
Yeah, I know. I wish there was like a standard clear cut answer to those questions. When I discuss this with foreign nationals and global mobility, the processing timing is going to depend on the consular post. And that's not so easy for people to plan. A lot of the consular posts abroad have been offering, visa processing without an interview. So This may go away in a Trump administration, but currently this is typically in process only in situations where the individual has previously been issued a visa stamp. And so for those interview waiver situations, the individual submits the passport and documentation via a Dropbox once they're in that country. And then they wait for the consular post to process the application. And that can take a few days to a few weeks to complete that process and get their passport back with the visa stamp in there. And then in some cases, though, the foreign national might be called into the consulate for an interview, or in some situations, the visa process could be delayed by weeks or months if the application is put in administrative processing. And really, it's one of those things we really can't predict, right? Some people ask us, like, can you tell us if there's any risk of being put into administrative processing? And it's really any visa application could be subject. And then, most of the time, unless there's a specific trigger that we are already aware of, most of the time it's not possible to predict whether a case is going to be pulled into administrative processing.
Right. And administrative processing can really throw a wrench into the entire visa application process, especially with when can the individual return to the United States. In many instances, as you noted, we'll work with clients if we know in advance that they're more likely than not to be subject to administrative processing. A lot of times at situations where someone had been placed in administrative processing previously, so maybe more likely than not, they'll go through administrative processing again at the U.S. consular post. And then the second time, sometimes it might not be that long. A lot of the administrative processing times can be within 3 weeks, but don't hold us to that because it could take a lot longer as well. And we, recommend that they plan accordingly, right? Even if they don't think they're going to be subject to administrative processing, it's always good to have a plan in place within the organization in case someone gets stuck abroad for various reasons, including administrative processing. So we want to make sure that we can, know in advance how it really will help with expectations from business operations and developing a backup plan as necessary.
Yeah, right. And we talked about working remotely in another Rapid Fire Wednesday episode. And what we talked about is that having a contingency plan based on the company policy from working from outside the US is a great way to deal with some of these potential issues. And as part of the plan, it's really important for the foreign national employee to provide notice to their manager, HR, and global mobility in advance of leaving the US so that the business can be prepared in order to address potential delays if it comes up. It's also important to plan appropriately, even if it won't be necessary to apply for a new visa stamp when abroad. So just because somebody's eligible for Dropbox or interview waiver, people shouldn't think that it's always going to be smooth and easy.
Right. So some of the, other individuals with who our clients apply and who we work with are those who are Canadian citizens, right? So with the exception of a Canadian citizen who has an E classification as a treaty trader or treaty investor or a K visa stamp, they're pretty much visa exempt and don't need to apply for a visa stamp at a consular post abroad in order to come into the US. So, what are the primary pieces of advice, Miki, that you provide to your clients to make sure that they're prepared when they're arriving at a US port of entry and are seeking admission to the US if they don't require a visa stamp, i.e., Canadian citizens?
Yeah, when I'm talking to foreign national employees and global mobility departments that are assisting, the key points really is that they make sure to have the passport with the proper duration. As I said, at least 6 months beyond the admission date, but ideally 6 months beyond the end date of the requested period of admission. And then in addition, a valid visa stamp, except for Canadians, and then the approval notice from USCIS if it's a petition based status, like the H1 or O1 or L1. And then it's also, best to carry some evidence of continued employment to present to Customs and Border Protection if asked about it. So, like recent pay stubs. And then for those individuals who applied for a visa stamp and submitted an employment verification letter, that can be presented at CBP as well. And then if the employee has TN status and they're Canadian and didn't have an approval through USCIS, they should have an admission stamp in their passport from their initial TN application with CBP, and then they can present that passport page when entering the US. For Canadian citizens with TN status, they'll have a TN visa stamp in their passport. And then foreign nationals that have dependents, like a spouse or children under the age of 21, those dependents may not necessarily have a separate USCIS approval notice. They would be relying on the primary worker's approval notice to show the period of authorized admission. And then, it's always good to carry the marriage certificate for spouse and then birth certificate for child in the event the CBP officer asks for proof of the relationship. Kim, I'd love to hear about your perspective since you're at the southern border in San Diego. Is there anything different if anyone is returning to the US from Mexico?
Yeah, the one thing that we utilize here at the southern border quite frequently is the automatic visa revalidation rule, which is available for a lot of individuals, except for some citizens. They're from Syria or Iran. There's a list of them. So always double check because that list could expand under the Trump administration. But right now, with automatic visa revalidation, it essentially means that individuals can travel to Mexico or to Canada without having a valid visa stamp in their passport as long as they meet certain criteria. And that criteria, again, is you're only traveling from the US to Mexico or from the US to Canada, no third countries in between. And then that your stay, that the individual stay in Mexico or Canada is for less than 30 days. So it's a brief period of time. And I'll just give an example of how this really works with us at the southern border. So let's say that an individual, graduated from a US university, they had an F1 visa stamp in their passport, and now their status has changed to H1B. They don't have an H1B visa stamp in their passport, but they want to go to Mexico, either down to the Guadalupe Valley for wine tasting and some amazing restaurants, or just to, Tijuana for Taco Tuesdays, which a lot of people tend to do. So what they would do is have an expired or an unexpired F1 visa stamp in their passport, but their status has changed to H1B while in the United States. So what they want to do is if they travel across the border, when they're re-entering at the southern border, they would present their valid passport with the expired visa stamp in their passport. And think of, even if that F1 visa is still essentially valid on its face, right? It says valid until a certain date for all intents and purposes, because they've now changed to H1B status. They're not utilizing that F1 visa stamp. So they would show passport with the visa stamp in it, along with the I-797 form, which is the approval notice for their H1B status. And on the bottom of that H1B approval notice, they'll have a new I-94 document. So it's really critical that when they're coming back into the United States, they tell the officer that they're utilizing the automatic visa revalidation so that they can enter back into the United States in H1B status, which was the status they held when they left the US. So it's one of those situations where if somebody's just going to be traveling across the border to Mexico for a short period of time or across the border to Canada for a short period of time, that they might be able to utilize the automatic visa revalidation. And one of the key things as well is that they cannot have applied for a new visa stamp while they are in Mexico. So that's key, right? It's really just trip to Canada or Mexico for a brief period of time. Do not apply for a new visa stamp while you're in that country. So if anybody is, going to be traveling across the border for that specific, short period of time, we always work with our immigration professionals in-house to make sure that the word gets out to their employees, as well as working with the employees to make sure that they have the appropriate documents when they're coming back into the US from Canada or Mexico. But like I said, down here in San Diego, we always make sure that, people are aware of this automatic visa revalidation rule. And our CBP officers, for the most part, are aware of the rule and it can be pretty helpful as well. But it's really good to ensure that people have the knowledge before they actually leave the US so they don't get stranded when they're overseas. Well, in this case, overseas being Mexico, it's not across the river or anything like that. So, Miki, what are some issues to watch out for, when individuals, once they're admitted into the US, right? So we talked about the visa application process, presenting yourself at CBP, and then what happens, once you're admitted to the US.
I always tell my global mobility partners and the foreign national employees that it's really, really important to access the I-94 record from the CBP website to make sure that all the information listed on the I-94 is accurate. And Sometimes there's a bit of a delay in the I-94s showing up on the website. Sometimes you really have to prod CBP and let them know that the I-94 is not showing up. It's important not only for the principal worker, but also for dependent members as well. And so if the I-94 can't be retrieved from the website or if there are mistakes, I think a common mistake that we see is an incorrect expiration date under the admit until section, or the visa category might be wrong. And so it becomes really important to kind of monitor that after admission to make sure that if there is any issue, to work with global mobility or immigration attorney to make the correction with CBP. And so CBP has a deferred inspections office for most ports of entry to facilitate these corrections. And so, it's important that these errors are caught right at the outset, because if somebody has been admitted under a dependent category, even though they're an H-1B worker, for example, their work authorization could be impacted. So that's something just really to be aware of and to be diligently checking out for each admission. I guess, one of the things that just stepping back, I would say that it's really important for anybody planning to travel over the holidays to consult with their immigration attorney to see if it's recommended to come back before the new administration takes office January 20th. Because we don't have a crystal ball and there's not been any definitive announcements related to potential travel bans. And we talked about this in another episode, but it's just important to keep in mind that that is a possibility. And so if you're traveling, best to come back before January 20th.
Yeah, it's really good advice, Miki. I mean, I'm sure you remember right after the inauguration in 2017, the travel ban that was released, and it actually surprised some of CBP officers. And there was a lot of chaos at the ports of entry. So we're trying to, based on the experience from before, warn our, immigration professionals and foreign nationals to really think and plan about travel and coming back before inauguration, especially if we don't have any specific guidance by then. Yeah, it was total chaos for a bit there. So we don't want anybody getting stuck abroad. We want them to be able to get back into the US and be able to continue to work and support that, the organizations here. So good piece of advice. With that, I think it's a wrap on our planning for international travel. And if you don't already, please subscribe to WR Immigration's LinkedIn profile, as well as to Miki's profile and mine as well. And we also transcribe our Rapid Fire Wednesday into a newsletter that you can subscribe to. So that will be released, with the important information going forward. And we look forward to providing updates and guidance as we move forward with what's coming down the pike. Thanks, Miki.
Thanks so much, Kim.